Good morning. Welcome to this circle, and welcome to those who circle with us online. As we come into this place, there are many who often circle with us today who are gathering at Camp Wohelo during the getaway weekend. We come into this circle just as we are. We come with our hopes and our disappointments. We come with our joys and our sorrows, our solitudes and our sense of community. Whoever we are and whatever our search, whatever our certainties or our uncertainties, wherever we find ourselves today, there's a place for us in this circle. As we gather on this land, we acknowledge our profound gratitude and respect for the Indigenous people of Cree and Métis heritage who made their home in this place for generations. We're indebted to the people of Treaty 6 for their culture, their songs, their dances, their stories, their ceremonies, all that has shaped the wisdom of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, with whom we seek to heal the wounds of the past and build a respectful and mutual future together. We come here to affirm that we're all kin. We are each part of the family. As we center ourselves in this time and place with each other, I invite you to complete each of my phrases with the words you find on the screen. In this new day, a day we've never seen before, breathing in the air that gave our grandparents breath, and breathing out the air that will give our children's children life. Seeking perspective and right relationship in life. Inspired by those whose love is stronger than hate. In this sacred time we share together. Because of light, we also have shadows. We also have shades. We gather in this light, also knowing the shadows of our grievances and our grudges, the shades of shame and blame. We come in the light of a new day, seeking to start fresh as the new light of a new day, a new beginning. We come into this new day, a day that invites us to start over, to let go of yesterday, to open to light and warmth, to live in the light of forgiveness and restoration. And so we come into this circle with light in our midst, seeking the light we need this day for our living. And we take this moment to bring ourselves into this circle, to ground ourselves in this time and in this place, to let light shine within us. We spend a lifetime learning to pray. Not words that call upon some super being to impose some will and change some destiny. But rather, we spend a lifetime learning to pray, to live more closely to the values that ground our lives, to focus our living, to start over, to begin again. Part of the tradition we receive in the Jesus stories are the friends around Jesus asking them to teach them to pray. And so over these summer months, we have been giving voice to a 21st century way of answering that request. Teach us to pray. Here are some words that might help us strengthen our intentions to live lives worthy of the breath we invest. So we pray together, offering these words. We embrace the sacredness of life with awe and reverence, and we commit ourselves to work for a more fair and just world. We seek to live with deep intention that all may have enough for today. May we let go of the guilt and regret, offering and receiving forgiveness as a way to freedom. May we live examined lives, inspired to find meaning and purpose in our living, working to transform every challenge into an opportunity to grow and thrive. May it ever be so. Every tradition has those apocryphal kinds of stories that are told around campfires, stories that build layer upon layer. This might be one of those kinds of stories. It's a story that has been told by many different people of a particular day in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work in South Africa. As you'll remember, when the apartheid era came to an end, part of the way of addressing the evils of racism, part of a way of addressing the evils of violence that had characterized that society for so long, was the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who would hear people's stories, who would also hear the confessions of those who had committed unspeakable acts. And in many cases, pardon would be given in exchange for that confession. In other cases, the community or the one who was most harmed would have a say in what would restore right relationship. This is a story that comes to us from that process of the Truth and Reconciliation work in South Africa. It was a particular day in a courtroom in South Africa. A frail black woman rises slowly to her feet. She's over 70 years of age. Facing her across the room are several white security police officers, one of whom, Mr. Vanderbroek, had been tried and found implicated in the murders of both this woman's son and her husband. He had come to the woman's house, taken her son, shot him at point-blank range, and then set the young man's body on fire while he and the officers partied nearby. Several years later, Van Broek and his cohorts had returned to take away her husband as well. For many months, she heard nothing of his whereabouts. Then, almost 2 years after her husband's disappearance, Van Broek came back to fetch the woman herself. How vividly she remembers that evening going to a place beside a river where she was shown her husband bound and beaten, still strong in spirit, lying on a pile of wood. The last words heard from his lips as the officers poured gasoline over his body and set him aflame were, "Father, forgive them." And now this woman stands in the courtroom and listens to the confessions offered by Mr. Van Brock. A member of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission turns to her and asks, "So, what do you want? How should justice be done to this man who has so brutally destroyed your family?" "I want 3 things," begins the old woman, but confidently. "I want first to be taken to the place where my husband's body was burned so I can gather up the dust and give him a decent burial." She pauses and then continues, "My husband and son were my only family. So I want secondly, therefore, for Mr. Van der Broek to become my son. I would like him to come to the township twice a month and spend a day with me so that I can pour out on him whatever love I still have in me. And finally," she said, "I want a third thing. This would also be the wish of my husband. I would kindly ask someone to come to my side and lead me across the courtroom so I can take Mr. Van der Broek in my arms and embrace him so he will know he is truly forgiven." The court assistants come to lead the elderly woman across the room, and Mr. Van der Broek is so overwhelmed by what he's just heard, he faints. And as he does, those in the courtroom, family, friends, neighbors, all victims of decades of oppression and injustice, begin to sing, softly but assuredly, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." This is a story that might not have happened just this way, but we know this story is true. This is a contemporary story that challenges our practices of forgiveness. Almost 4/5 of the first book that creates the text of Holy Scriptures for Jews and for Christians is the story of just one family. It begins with Abraham and Sarah, continues through their son Isaac, and this morning we hear part of the story of their great-grandson, Joseph. The Joseph we all know as the owner of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. He saw them from a distance, and before he came near them, they conspired with each other to kill him. They said to each other, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we'll say that a wild animal devoured him, and we'll see what becomes of his dreams now." But when Reuben, the eldest brother, heard it, he said, "Let's not take his life. Let's not shed his blood. Let's just throw him here in the pit, but lay no hand on him." He said that, thinking he might rescue him later from their hand and restore him to their father. So when Joseph came, they stripped him of his robe, that long robe with sleeves he wore, and they took him and they threw him in a pit. The pit was empty. There wasn't any water in it. And then the brothers sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum and balm and resin. They were on their way to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and concealing his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay any hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our flesh and bone." And his brothers agreed. And when the traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And the Ishmaelites took Joseph to Egypt. The story continues that years after Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, they lied to their father about him. A severe famine came to the land of Israelite, and it sent the brothers south to Egypt in search of food. When they came to Egypt, they found Joseph in a position of power. He was the one in charge of rationing the food supply, but they didn't know it was their brother. And this is how the story continues. When Joseph saw them again, he could no longer control himself, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers couldn't answer him. They were so dismayed at his presence. Sometime later, they brought his youngest brother. And when he saw his brother Benjamin, he fell on him and he wept. And he kissed him. And all the brothers wept. And after that, they talked together. This is an ancient story that challenges our practice of forgiveness. that special coat, was almost the death of him. And thanks to Andrew Lloyd Webber, we remember Joseph's legendary coat, even if we've forgotten his very colorful story. He was the second youngest of a dozen sons, and he was his daddy's favorite. And his younger brother was the apple of his mother's eye. And this poisonous favoritism in his family was a recipe for disaster. With one father, 4 mothers, 12 deeply jealous and highly competitive brothers, and who the heck knows how many anonymous sisters, Jacob's family would have kept a small cadre of family therapists busy for generations. You remember how in the world of this ancient story, Joseph's brothers grew to hate him for his grandiose dreams and also for his father exempting him from spending his days working in the fields like the rest of them. No one wore a coat with long sleeves when you do field work all day long. So when they're far from their watchful eye of the father, his jealous brothers, of course, plot to kill him. And at the last moment, one of the more enterprising brothers saw an opportunity to make a buck and still get what they were hoping for, rid of Joseph. So he persuades the others to sell him rather than kill him, and they cash in on these traders passing by on their way to Egypt. And they soak his distinctive coat in animal blood to give a little physical evidence to support their story to their father that Joseph was killed by some wild animal. It's one thing to be betrayed by a complete stranger. Crime of circumstance, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it's another thing entirely to be betrayed and victimized by those closest to us. As we know and as we've been hearing over these last weeks, that was so true in the genocide that we remember in 1994 in Rwanda. And it's true of every genocide that's predicated on propaganda, fueled by a campaign to see another as less than human, but carried out by neighbors and acquaintances and friends and family members, not by a foreign invader or by strangers. In the betrayals, small and great, that we each experience in life, whether they are the unthinkable acts of cruelty and brutality, whether they are abuses that scar our bodies, our minds, our spirits for a lifetime, or whether they are those hurts of day-to-day living, our betrayals generally come from those close to us, from those we should be able to trust, from the institutions we value, from the colleagues and friends and family we think we can count on. Those wounds of betrayal are often inflicted by those we know and by those who know us, by those in whom we've placed our trust. And the acts of betrayal in this ancient story are many. These sons continue to betray their father every day as they live out this charade. They continue to betray him every day as they watch him grieve, and their secret remains safe because not one of them will break the code of silence, even though they see their father's heart break day after day and year after year. But in the world of all good legends and fables and stories, Joseph is sold again by traders to a high-ranking official in Egypt. And as any good story goes, through the rising and falling of unbelievable changes of fortune, in time and against all odds, Joseph goes from slave to prisoner, and then he becomes deputy pharaoh in Egypt. And shortly after Joseph's rise to political power, hunger brings his brothers, hoping to find food for their large and growing families. And now Joseph truly has the upper hand, not only because he has the power to supply the food for their hunger, but also because he has the advantage of recognizing his siblings, whereas they don't have the first clue that they're seeking help from the brother that they betrayed and brutalized. This is an occasion we've witnessed many times in our history. Those times when the tables are turned, and now the victim, in this story, the character Joseph, has the supreme opportunity for revenge, for retribution, for retaliation. Because what happens next in the narrative is entirely in the power of only one character. It's entirely up to Joseph. And his response will really depend on the state of his heart and the state of his healing journey. It will depend on whether his losses have constricted and guarded his heart, or whether he has allowed his losses to soften and open his heart. It took time, and it took tears. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen without great grief, but in slow, incremental moments. As Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he begins to reinstate himself in a family that rejected him. And he arranges to be reunited with his father, and comes to provide his brothers not only with the opportunity to survive, but also with the opportunity to thrive. And it all could have turned out so differently. Their father could have found the son he thought he'd lost, only to spend the rest of his days enraged and exiles from the sons who had caused him so much grief, so much pain. But the one who had experienced the most hurt reached out with love instead of hate, reached out from an open heart instead of a closed heart. And the one who had the supreme opportunity to get even took the initiative to forgive. Our capacity to forgive isn't contingent on our fortunes in life. It's not about what happens to us. It's about how we choose to respond to what happens to us. Isn't that the great spiritual teaching that is embodied in Jesus of Nazareth, embodied in Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, embodied in Mahatma Gandhi, in Martin Luther King Jr., in Nelson Mandela, in Israeli and Palestinian members of the family circle, in Dr. Izzy Abuleish, who refused to hate the Israelis who killed 3 of his daughters and his niece in Gaza, in Lloyd LeBlanc, the hero of Dead Man Walking, whose only son, David, was brutally murdered, in Matthew Shepard's mother, whose beloved son was tortured and killed by fear turned into hatred. In these and countless other ordinary and extraordinary individuals whose names we'll never know, but who have known some of life's greatest losses, who are the survivors of the deepest and most painful tragedies, who have every apparent reason to hate, every apparent reason to refuse to forgive, but who in great courage and with no small amount of grief choose life over death, not only for themselves, but for those they've wounded and those who have wounded them. They choose to know life in all its vulnerabilities, letting their hearts be broken open, never to close to the world again. It's really easy in our lives to be derailed by our betrayals. It's easy to be overwhelmed by our hurts and our losses. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the state of the world, by the inexplicable acts of inhumanity and utter cruelty. And our journeys into healing begin in knowing that our deepest wounds are the places of our greatest possibility. They're the portals through which we can pour our compassion and our wisdom. Our wounds invite us to be alive. They invite us to risk and to hope and to reach through them into the heart of another. Reconciliation is sometimes out of reach. It's simply not possible because reconciliation requires something from another. It requires something from both victims and offenders, from the perpetrator and the injured. But forgiveness needs no one but me, no one but you. It requires absolutely nothing from another. It's completely within my power and completely within your power to give it or to withhold it. Joseph could have been as dead as his brothers reported him to be if he had allowed the betrayal and the hurt to imprison him inside his own heart. As we consider the betrayals that we have witnessed and the betrayals we have experienced, both small and great, the betrayals of our species, violating the highest and best of our humanity, the betrayals of those we love, those who love us. This is our time to consider what it is the spiritual practice of forgiveness asks of us. This is our time to consider refusing to let our losses shrink our hearts, but instead to invite our losses to soften our hearts, so that our losses might become a path to living an authentic life with an expansive heart. So we pause to ask ourselves, what is it that forgiveness requires of us? In another story that has come down to us in the Jesus tradition, a friend of Jesus said, "How many times must I forgive?" 7? 7 seems like a good number. In the Hebrew mind, it's the number of completeness, perfection. And the answer we get in our tradition is, no, not 7. How about 70 times 7? Or maybe we're never done with it, or maybe it's a way of saying forgiveness is never done with us. There's no end to it. We go because the light of love is stronger than the light of hate. We go because there is more light in embracing one another than there is at holding one another hostage to our anger. We go to live in the light that we know. We go to live in the light that is within us. We go in the great light of love, free to be true.